You are most welcome to the Center for Global Finance Research Seminar today. And we are absolutely delighted today to have research findings on an absolutely interesting topic of natural disasters and international reserves. How vulnerable are developing countries? This is, in the current terminologies, referred to as disaster risk finance or risk finance, or the finance rating to disasters, risks, and natural unstoppable consequences. And this is important and timely in terms of where the global economies are, where the global financial system is currently operating, and the major concern facing world economies and central banks, particular, is liquidity. And part of that liquidity, of course, rating is the role of international reserves. So this seminar is absolutely timely. And it combines a number of research questions the speakers will be explaining. But what I love about it is the extent of the scope of being able to cover a huge number of countries, more than 60% of the world economies, and combining for about 5 decades to be able to distill that data, do some serious number crunching, and diversify the scope of natural disasters, the various types of natural disasters, and what this means for international reserves. It's an area of great interest for many years, but particularly today, but also is related to some of the challenges we have on natural resources, environmental issues, climate change, all rolled into one. And the fact that we are able to get insight from all regions on the world, including Africa, Latin America, North Africa, MENA, that's also absolutely reassuring. And so what is particularly interesting and for which we are delightful is the opportunity for us to attract one of the key researchers in this particular area for many years, Dr. Osman Ouattara, and his co-authors to be able to spare time and share their research findings with us today. I have known Ouattara for quite a long time now, and delighted at his eminent role he's playing in economics and in economic research. He's a development economist and occupying a position of reader in development economics. A reader is a position which, in foreign currency terms, is sometimes referred to as associate professor. And he is at the prestigious Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And indeed, he obtained his PhD at the same University of Manchester, and has since been concentrating his research in key areas like the macroeconomic effects of natural disaster, climate change that I alluded to earlier. But he has also worked in other areas of economics, especially international finance, seen his work on foreign aid and FDI, poverty and inequality, growth and productivity, the role of institutions. So he's covered quite a huge amount of ground, but has established himself as a prolific researcher, publishing in top journals in this particular area. And also, I remember from some of his work, his particular comprehensive data set on property rights has been of great reference by researchers in this area. So we're delighted, Osman, to welcome you here to SOAS.
Thank you.
And for you to be able to share with us your research. In terms of housekeeping, we will run the presentation almost for about 45, maybe an hour. During that time, if you have any feedback, it would be useful if you could post it to the chat or keep your questions handy. Of course, if it is so pressing that you can't hold on for a minute, of course, you could always put up your hand and be on watch out. But in most cases, we would prefer that we give Osman interrupted a flow of the issues and great coverage. And then after that, we can go into the cut and thrust of this discourse, debate some questions, issues, contribute, especially this is work in progress. Seminars of this nature have two main roles in the work in progress. One is to be able to comment on the work and give feedback to the researcher. And the second one, of course, is for us to be able to start teasing out some misuse, plan some extension of this work. And so there is a kind of feedback and feed forward mechanism that would encourage you to generously contribute here as part of the discussion. So, Osman, please, you are most welcome. Let's give you a hand of applause and welcome you to come and start the presentation. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you first for the invitation to the seminar. This is a great pleasure. And thank you for the introduction. Before going into details, it's probably a good idea to give you a flavor of what the paper is about. So what we are trying to do here is to try to bring together three different types of literature to answer a simple research question. That is, whether natural disasters are a threat to external vulnerability. The first of this literature is the well-known literature on the motives for reserve accumulation, which has been extensive and actually kind of gained momentum after the East Asian financial crisis. The second literature is the literature on the macroeconomic effect of natural disaster, and which Victor just pointed is very topical. And the third literature is the literature on the characteristics and measures of external vulnerability, reserve adequacy. What constitutes external vulnerability? As Victor kind of mentioned, this work is a work in progress. So basically what I'm going to do here is to present some of the findings we have so far. There are further analysis to be carried out. Again, before I go any further, my co-authors, as you could see here, are Michael Dankwa, who is at UNU Wider, and William Homing, who is at the Ghana Institute of Management and Policy Administration. Okay, just a background to the paper. The frequency of natural disaster has increased almost fourfold over the last 5 decades. And to put things into context, before 1960, there were about 39 natural disasters reported worldwide. In 2022, there are about 300 and 87 natural disasters reported. So the frequency has increased. And one of the reasons of this high increase in frequency is linked to the effect of climate change. As climate change kind of worsen, we'll have more and more floods, more and more storm, and more drought. And between 1970 and 2009, natural disaster accounted more than half of all hazard experienced worldwide, and 45% of all reported death, and 74% of all economic losses. So if you think of financial crisis, okay, and then you compare that to the loss generated by natural disaster, you can see that natural disaster kind of produce more detrimental effect on the economies. And to give you some example, if you look at Storm Maria in 2017, constituted about 69.4 billion losses to the Caribbean. Storm Irma, 58 billion to Cape Verde. And in Africa, we have something like 1,695 disasters recorded. Although floods constitute 60% of this disaster, the death related to natural disaster, actually 94% of them come from a drought. In Asia, 2 trillion reported economic damage. In South America, 29.2. So the whole world is actually affected by natural disaster, not just developing countries, but also developed countries. We can go back to Storm Katrina in 2005. The losses in America were about 163 billion. The recent flood in Germany and in Belgium, about 43 billion. So in short, okay, countries are becoming more and more exposed to natural disaster. And of course, if there's a natural disaster, there's a cost associated, not just the loss, but the cost of construction, for example, if you have an earthquake or you have a flood, and also kind of putting a fiscal stress on a government. So how to mitigate this? You can ensure against natural disaster, but how? By pulling resources together. For example, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, where this country pulled together all funding, okay? And in the case of a storm or a hurricane, this funding has dispersed to help them with the reconstruction. That will kind of stop you from going to borrow extra money to finance the reconstruction. Or you can accumulate international reserve as a precaution, as you did in the past with financial crisis, banking crisis, and sudden stuff. Okay, so the kind of you can accumulate reserve on the basis of precautionary motive. And to go back to this issue of precautionary motives, evidence or experience show that emerging and developing countries have been kind of accumulating reserves since the East Asian financial crisis. Okay, so the accumulation is there are many reasons why a country accumulate, but the main reason is the precautionary motive. So you accumulate reserve in case of the problem, you use this reserve, for example, to meet a necessary requirement. And there are several empirical studies, okay, that have supported the importance of the precautionary motive as the main motive for accumulating international reserve. But the problem is now this country have faced with natural disaster. Okay, although they were accumulating against financial crisis, sudden stop, and banking crisis, they are faced now with natural disaster, and natural disaster tend to mimic the effect of this crisis. For example, drop in economic activity. Okay, this is one of the issue. In addition, of course, to the human loss generated by these natural disaster, you have the economic loss. And if you remember one of the previous slides, 74% of all losses are kind of attributed to natural disaster, even more than banking crisis. Okay, and natural disasters actually are also a threat for the financial stability. And in 2015, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, in his speech, breaking the tragedy of the horizon, kind of say that the climate poses a threat even to financial stability, because if you have flood, this will put a stress on insurance company, and the whole economy will kind of suffer from these natural disaster. So it could be that country, to ensure against this natural disaster, they will accumulate reserve. And also what you need to perhaps bear in mind, maybe a financial crisis, a banking crisis will send initial signal, so you are prepared for. But in the case of natural disaster, it could come suddenly. An earthquake could come overnight. Okay, you are not prepared for it. So there's even more need to accumulate reserve to make to prepare for these eventualities. If you look at the literature, there's a sizable literature that has explored the macroeconomic impact of natural disaster. Okay, Raddatz, Loesa, Fombieta, Flebemer, and Grosch 2014, they've all looked at the impact of a natural disaster on growth. What emerged from these studies is that a natural disaster lead to contraction in growth, same as a financial crisis will do. And also, a natural disaster impose a fiscal stress on government, increase in spending for the reconstruction, increase in the budget deficit, okay, because revenue also fall because of natural disaster, okay, and also because resources are moved away from productive investment to spending on the reconstruction, then you have investment which is also lower. And work by Ouattara and Strobel 2013-2018 in the context of Caribbean country really show that hurricane strike lead to budgetary deficit and so on. Other studies have also looked at the inflationary impact of natural disaster. And Hanin et al. 2015, Parker 2018, Apergis and Payne and Klopp 2020. And Parker, for example, shows that depending on the natural disaster considered, you have increase in inflation. Okay, he also looked at different type of inflation, and natural disaster tend to trigger a inflationary pressure. So it's not just about contraction in economic activity, stress, fiscal stress, but also a monetary implication. Of course, if inflation increases following natural disaster, monetary authorities have to implement policy to respond to this shock. So in addition to reserve accumulation, there's also other effect of natural disaster, which may have ramification for the overall economy. However, a limited number of studies have actually explored the link between disaster and international reserve. As far as we are aware, we can think of two studies, Gingerak, Noy, et al. 2020, and Strobel, Ouattara, and Kaplan 2020 as well. Gingerak, Noy, et al. Focus on earthquake, okay, for 103 countries. And what they found is that countries exposed to earthquake tend to accumulate for precautionary purpose in the 5 years following a large earthquake. Okay, Strobel et al. 2020 focus on Caribbean countries, and they show that there is a short-term increase in the reserve following hurricane strike. Okay, so these are the only two studies that we are kind of aware of, which have looked on the impact of natural disaster on international reserve.
Let me interrupt you, Osman.
Yeah.
It appears that Refire Maleka has her hand up. Do you have a pressing question, Refire?
Yes, please, sir. Thank you for acknowledging my hand. So per your encouragement for us to post questions on the chat, it appears as though only team members are allowed to. I'm not sure what that means, but I personally cannot post a question that I've had based on the presenters' information shared so far.
Okay, I think my team in the background are going to look into it, but in the meantime, you may go ahead and share your question.
I just wanted to find out who came up with the definition of a developing country and what is your understanding of that definition?
Okay, I think that's the standard definition used in the literature. Developing countries are basically countries. It's based on the classification of the World Bank. Low income countries. Okay, so these are, this is the standard definition in the field. I know it's controversial, but this is the standard definition that they use. Sorry?
Sorry, I'm trying to get to your opinion about that. So I understand that it's standard, it's controversial, but based on, us kind of lacking behind in terms of the studies of culture, behavioral economics, and relevant investment theories for these so-called developing countries. What is your opinion on that? If you're comfortable to answer, if you're not, it's okay.
I mean, my own opinion. I mean, developing countries. I mean, it's been the standard definition used for many years. A country that are within certain geographical areas, not in Western Europe, Central North America, or who have a high income. In terms of the controversy around it, I will. It's not because this does not really interfere with the findings of our paper, but I personally do not have any opinion. It's just people's interpretations of things.
Yeah. Thanks, Osman. I think yes, Rafire. I think we are taking more or less the definitions used both by the UN and also by World Bank and other organizations, whereby the countries are being classified by the GDP per capita and then into a number of tranches. So this work is not proposing a new definition of developing country. It takes the definitions and the data source based on that kind of definition. However, you may have a big point if you say you may want to reclassify these countries and maybe the results will change. Who knows? But I think Osman is taking the given standard definition we all use in the literature.
Thank you for that clarification, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So basically what I say, the two studies, Gingerak et al. And Strobel, focus on a specific natural disaster. Gingerak et al. Focus on earthquake. Strobel et al. Focus on hurricanes in the context of the Caribbean. Okay, so in this paper, our contribution first is to bring in the four types of natural disaster, which are drought, storm, flood, and earthquake, which represent more than 60% of all disaster. Okay, and the thing also to bear in mind, Gingerak et al. And Strobel et al., the measure of reserve that they use is generally a total reserve over GDP. This will probably capture the size of your reserve vis-a-vis the size of your country, but it does not really say anything about external vulnerability. So basically, in addition to expanding the number of natural disasters, we kind of move away from the GDP-based measure of reserve adequacy to kind of embrace a measure which is more or less used to capture a external vulnerability. Okay. So 2 questions, however. One may ask, how do disaster affect reserve? Okay. Pre-disaster, we have the precautionary motive, which we discussed earlier. Could be an insurance against natural disaster, could help in reducing the borrowing need for reconstruction. And in the context of Caribbean country, it helped to cover import requirement for food, medical supply following the natural disaster. Post-natural disaster, there's also evidence that there's aid surge, which will increase international reserve. There is also remittances. People, migrant, for example, will send remittances to the family back home in the stricken country. Tourist sector will be affected, so therefore reduction in tourist revenue. The export sector could also be affected, therefore a reduction in international reserve. So basically, following natural disaster, there could be an increase in international reserve or a reduction in the exertion in international reserve, depending on which dominate. The next, perhaps the most important question is, what is external vulnerability? The definition has changed over the years. And before World War II, it was the money-based reserve adequacy. Basically, how much reserve you have to cover the money supply. Okay. In the case of capital flight, for example, you should have enough reserve to kind of cover the demand for money. However, after the Great Depression, attention has moved to the trade-based measure of external vulnerability. How much reserve do you have to cover 3 months worth of import? Okay, so you should have it, you should accumulate enough reserve to cover at least 3 months worth of report. And since the Asian financial crisis, attention has based to the debt-based measure of reserve adequacy. Okay, what is known as the Guidotti-Grispan rule. You should have enough reserve to cover short-term debt. That means 1 year or less maturity. Okay, so if you do not have enough reserve to cover the short term, you could mean the signal that you send it, you are in a weak liquidity position. And in fact, while this is attributed to Guidotti and Grispan, in 1930, John Maynard Keynes actually alluded to this in the context of India, when he argued that the government should have enough reserve to cover foreign funds. That is after the East Asian financial crisis that this has become a prominent measure for external vulnerability. And then several studies, Grispan, Roderick, and Velasco 99, and so on, have discussed the pros and cons of each of these measures and came to the conclusion that the short-term measure of external vulnerability is a superior in terms of measuring external vulnerability. And Calafel and Bosque 2002 argue that the preference is based on 3 factors. Okay, country low reserve short-term ratio is more vulnerable to speculative attack or external shocks, for example. And during financial crisis, the ratio of international reserve to short-term debt tend to be low. Okay, and also this ratio will dictate how much international help, how much you will need from the international community. So therefore, in this study, we use this measure of external vulnerability. And also from a practical point and empirical point, the trade-based measure is difficult to obtain because if for countries, the data on monthly import is not available. So it will be difficult to kind of use that measure anyway. Okay, so summing up so far, our objective is to investigate whether natural disaster heighten external vulnerability. And our definition of external vulnerability here is a total reserves less gold as a ratio of short-term debt. So if natural disaster reduce total reserve as a ratio of short-term debt, we classify this as a threat to external vulnerability. Of course, this ratio here could be affected, could be reduced if total reserve are reduced or if short-term debt kind of increase. In terms of methodology, there are different methodology that can be used to answer this research question, going from fixed effect, random effect, or GMM, or all sort of technique. But we prefer a panel VAR framework because we are able to trace the individual shock over a certain time horizon. Okay. So basically, our panel VAR has two parts. The first part composed of the endogenous variable, which are represented by the Y's, and the second part, which is composed by the exogenous variable, which are the X's. I will discuss the set of endogenous variable later on, but the X's are represent the different natural disaster that we are investigating. And you have the usual suspect and medial fixed effect and the error term here. And if you want to write it, but this is just mathematical definition. What is important here is to capture the response of the endogenous variable to one unit shock on XIT is represented by this expression here. If my Greek language is correct, this is lambda L equals A L to the power minus 1 BL. So basically, this kind of measure, okay, this part here measure the response of YT to one unit shock on XT, which is the natural disaster. In terms of the data, okay, our external vulnerability data already discussed that. Okay, is a short-term based reserve adequacy measure, which calculated for IMF, IFS, and the World Bank World Development Indicator. For the endogenous variable, we use trade openness, domestic saving, oil rent, capital control, which is from Chin and Ito, and oil rent, domestic saving, trade openness are from the World Bank World Development Indicators. In terms of the exogenous variable, our exogenous variable include a drought, earthquake, flood, and storm, which come from the emergency and event database, which is maintained by the Center for the Research on Epidemiology of Disaster. The criteria to satisfy for an event to be classified as a disaster is that one of the following has to be met. 10 or more people are reported killed. 100 or more people reported affected. Affected are those that are injured or displaced or in need of emergency. And also, there should be a declaration of state of emergency. And if a country calls for international assistance. So for a disaster, therefore, to be recorded in the EM database, one of the following criteria need to be met. Okay. Now, the figure that you see here, or the figure in the EM data, are in absolute value. Okay. For example, if you take a small country, a country with a small population of 10, Okay, 10 or more people reported killed in a small population is not the same as 10 more people killed in the high population. Okay, and this is also true for the people affected. So there might be a way to normalize. So the literature has kind of derived a measure based on this information. Okay, so they calculate, Fombi et al., Parker, among others, you calculate an intensity. The intensity, you take the value of 1. If the fatalities, means those that are killed, plus around a third of those that are affected, is greater than 0.1% of the population. The argument is 0.3 is enough. So basically what that means here, you give more weight if there are people killed than people injured. So if there are people killed, that means the intensity is high. But some people have played with that number here. For example, giving a weight of 0.5 or giving equal weight. And the conclusion reached is more or less the same. And if it's not greater than 0.1% of the population, then it takes a value of 0. So the K here represents the type of disaster, which are the 4 disasters. And the J here indicates the number of events, because a country can face the same disaster several times in a year. So you need to kind of account for that. You need to account for the frequency. So once you calculate the intensity, you kind of produce your disaster shock, which is the sum of all the intensity in a year, or basically multiply by the frequency. So the shock here take into account the frequency. So what that means is not just, imagine a country with one disaster, okay? It's not the same as another country which has a disaster 3 times in a year. So you need to account as well for the frequency of this of the disaster. And in terms of a sample, we have a sample of 98 countries. And between 1970 and 2017, we have an unbalanced panel data. So meaning that for some country, the information is missing over the years. Okay. Now some summary statistic. I'll focus on the debt. If you look at the debt here, the ratio, the maximum here is 1,142, which is a bit misleading. I think this is Sudan in 1990, which might be explained perhaps by high reserve. But if you take the average for all the country over the whole period, okay, and the value goes from around the minimum here 0.0434 to 60 for the vast majority of country. But for 3 countries, this ratio is greater than 145. I think 145, 165, and 185. And incidentally, these 3 countries appear to be Congo, Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and also Sudan. They seem to be kind of outliers, but we'll deal with that in our regression. If you look at the event here, okay, storm here, there's a country with about 27 storm, drought probably last year, and flood 20, and I think this is China. I think probably the 2003. In 2003, where about 20 flood recorded, which killed about 3,000 people, and earthquake here. I think in 1990 there were about 11 earthquakes recorded in China. So this gives you a kind of an overview of the data used in the analysis. And one requirement for our panel var X here, and the endogenous variable have to be stationary. If they are not, then you make them stationary. Because we have an unbalanced panel, we have to use the first generation unit test. Unfortunately, we could not use the second generation cross-sectional dependence, which require that we have a balanced panel. So the variable, fortunately, are stationary. We did not have to do any first difference. Given that the data is annual, we set the maximum lag to 2, and this is what we use to derive our result. We compute the mean response, cumulative response, and also impulse response function. Some result now. If you look at the mean response here, starting with drought, okay, you can see that on impact here, the coefficient, the estimate. So basically what you use, we use the confidence band to construct a one-tail significance level. On impact here, there's no effect. You have to wait until the 4th year to see that a drought have a negative effect on our reserve adequacy measure based on the short-term debt. Okay, so, and now moving to earthquake, while the coefficient is negative, we do not have any statistical significance. Okay, so, and then floods, again, as you could see here, we have a strong significance here for flood, and the coefficient actually increasing as you go along up to year 2 here. This represents the years, by the way, okay, up to year 2 and start declining, but it still remain statistically significant. And moving to storm here, we don't find any effect. So basically what this means here, a storm in this context here does not seem to have a significant effect on our measure of reserve adequacy use here. Okay, this is up to 6 years, but what we do, we kind of plot the impulse response function. As you could see here, up to year 4, there's no significant, but from year 4 onward to year 12, okay, you can see that the effect here is negative and significant. Okay, with earthquake, again, as you can see here, there's no significance because the mean response here is on either side of the 0, so statistically non-significant. With respect to flood, you can see that our all-time horizon, there's a negative effect on our reserve adequacy measure, okay, which decreased on impact by around 1.4 percentage point, okay, reach a maximum here, increasing again, but it remained statistically significant. So flood tend to reduce our measure of reserve adequacy here. And storm, as you could see here, have not effect, mirroring what we have. So what we have done now in the next, what we accumulate, we see if the response actually accumulate over the time horizon. So we look at the cumulative response. So basically adding the mid response. And with respect to drought, you could see that largely not significant until probably after year 10, because it takes time for drought to build up, you know, which makes sense. Earthquake, we expect, because the mean response is not significant, we expect it to be insignificant in this context here as well. Interestingly, again, for flood, there's a strong evidence that flood on impact and over on-time horizon tend to reduce our short-term measure of reserve adequacy, okay, or external vulnerability measure here. Again, storm, we do not have any effect. Okay, so in terms of summarizing what we've seen so far, some indication of a negative significant effect, earthquake and storm, no effect, flood, strong evidence of negative significant effect on reserve short-term debt. Okay, next, we drop outliers. Okay, as you saw from the statistic, there were some outliers. So basically what we done, we drop, first of all, the high outliers that have excessive ratio. And then we drop low outlier, those are with a ratio less than 1. And in the third exercise, we kind of drop all the outliers. But I'm just going to present one case here. Again, the result do not change much with drought. I think the only difference is the negative effect happened much earlier. Okay, drought tend to reduce our measure. And earthquake, even dropping the outliers, does not affect our result. And again, with flood, we still get more or less the same result, and also the same result with a storm shock. So dropping these outliers does not seem to affect our result. And this is evident here, the drought shock. Drought become now more pronounced earlier than before by dropping the outliers. So it means drought tend to increase vulnerability in this context here. Earthquake does not have any significant effect, and flood tend to reduce the ratio as before, and the storm have no effect. So again, those findings, even after dropping the outliers, okay, are more or less similar to what we obtained before. Okay. So next, we kind of drop the global financial crisis period. Okay. So during this period, reserve have increased from 5%, okay, in 1990 to over 30% of GDP in 2009. So basically, it could be that during that period, the increase in reserve is due to this global financial crisis. And also, by doing that, we address one of the issues in the literature. During that period, South Korea and China have amassed or accumulated a lot of, they've been criticized for accumulating a lot of reserve. Okay, Korea is not part of a sample, but China is part of our sample. So, you know, so by kind of dropping this period, we also capture this effect. So we estimate for the period 1970-2005. So rather than show you more graphs, okay, I'll try to summarize it here with some nice color, because probably it's easier to understand than showing you the impulse response function. Okay, and for the paper we use the impulse response function, but for the sake of this presentation, I thought, you know, this color scheme will probably better help in understanding the result. So when we kind of estimate the effect dropping the global financial crisis period, what we see here, drought is no longer a significant, both the mean response and the cumulative response. Okay. However, earthquake become positive, okay, and significant, 6 years and above, which kind of confirm the paper by Ginjarak et al., who argued that the country tend to accumulate the reserve 5 years after the shock. However, the cumulative effect is not significant. Flood tend to kind of maintain the same significance level and also the same effect. So flood kind of survive this robustness check. Okay, if you look at the two results that I presented, flood tend to reduce the reserve adequacy measure. Storm in this case do not have any statistically significant effect. Okay, so the only result that we can actually be confident of maintaining is the effect of flood, because the other natural disaster, the effect varies depending on the scenario. Okay, and next robustness check that we do, we split by region, because some regions are prone to specific disaster. For example, if you take earthquake, they tend to occur around the Circum-Pacific belt, or also known as the Ring of Fire and the April belt. And you also, the Horn of Africa is known for its drought. And in the Caribbean region, for example, you have a lot of storm. So maybe by kind of investigating this regional aspect, we'll kind of have more insight into the effect of natural disaster. Starting with Sub-Saharan Africa, okay, I use the color scheme again. Starting with Sub-Saharan Africa, we were expecting drought to have an effect, but unfortunately, drought did not seem to have an effect. And so both for mean and also cumulative, we would have been concerned if earthquake have an effect, because I don't think Sub-Saharan Africa has much earthquake. Again, flood seems to exert a negative effect on our reserve adequacy measure. So from all the results we have presented so far, flood seems to be the culprit. With regard to storm, we have two scenarios. If we kind of take all the Sub-Saharan African country, the effect of storm is short term, okay, 1 to 2 years, and then the effect disappears. But if we drop the outliers, okay, which are Congo, Sudan, and Cameroon, and the effect of storm become a long run. So depending on the scenario, again, storm has an effect on our reserve adequacy measure in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. Latin America, quite interesting. Drought has no effect here, as you could see from the yellow, but earthquake, for some reason, does not have a negative effect, okay? On the contrary, earthquake tend to increase the ratio, which is a bit puzzling at the beginning. But if you look at it, it could make sense, because earthquake are very rare disaster, and when they occur, they tend to kind of send some. They're more psychological, okay, and people are more responsive to earthquake than storm or a flood, for example. There will be more help for an earthquake. And also for Latin America and the Caribbean, it could be through remittances, for example, because a migrant in the US, for example, sending money to their families in this region. And it could also be because of the aid surge following the earthquake. Okay, so this could explain that. If you take a country like Haiti, for example, Haiti will probably receive more help, financial help, if they had an earthquake than, let's say, flood or storm. And also you have the aid media, which is much more geared towards earthquake than any other disaster, such as drought and so on. In the context of Latin America, what we found is that flood tend to have a short-term effect. But as expected, and following our own work in the context of a Caribbean country, we found that storm have a negative effect on our measure of reserve adequacy, and that this area is prone to storm. Okay, so flood, again, in this context here, for Sub-Saharan Africa, definite, and in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, short-term, but storm here seem to have an effect. Already there is a kind of heterogeneity in terms of the effect of flood for different regions. South Asia, probably that's where there's the least effect. Drought and earthquake do not have any effect, and flood and storm tend to have a short-run effect. And for flood, a negative effect on the ratio, and for storm, a short-run effect, about one or 2 years. So the effect doesn't really lack. There seems to be an increase in the ratio here. And for MENA countries, this was also a bit puzzling. We're trying to understand. They don't seem to be affected in terms of, we are not saying that they are not affected in terms of other macroeconomic variables such as growth or fiscal stress, but in terms of this measure here, MENA countries are not affected. We're trying to understand why this is the case, It could be that because they have a more cooperation among them through different organizations, such as the Arab League and so on. It could be also that when we look at the statistics, they have less disaster in terms of the measure that we use here compared to other countries. But given that there are more results to derive, it could be that this change later on. And in the context of East Asia and Pacific, we come back again. What we found here is that flood continue to kind of have an effect, and the other disaster, drought, earthquake, do not have any effect. So to sum up the result here, okay, do natural disaster increase external vulnerability of country? Broadly, our answer is yes. And which natural disaster? Because as you look at the result, different natural disasters tend to generate different effects. Floods overall appear to heighten vulnerability the most. Okay, and there is some evidence that a drought may affect country vulnerability, and we have less evidence in terms of earthquake and storm. They tend to be a kind of specific to region. And also we kind of seen regional differences also in terms of the effect of natural disaster, with MENA country kind of showing no effect. As I say, this is work in progress. We are still working on the paper. Okay. What we'll try to do next is to look at low versus high reserve holding countries, because this can also probably shed more light on these on the result here. Okay. Is the response of a country with high reserve the same as those with low reserve? So this could make a difference. And also, while this might not matter for external vulnerability, probably for a policy perspective, it's important to know whether the reduction in the adequacy measure is due to a reduction in reserve or an increase in short-term debt, probably for the reconstruction, or both. Okay, so there's a possibility that both change, but depending on the magnitude of the change, the ratio can be reduced. The other thing we are considering is alternative disaster shock measures. Okay, in the measure that we used before, we consider 0.1% of the population. Okay, and this could be increased. So basically, what we have done so far capture what we term in the literature as moderate intensity. Okay, you can have severe intensity by calculating the same thing, but rather than considering 0.1% of the population, you consider 1% of the population. So normally, this should kind of, perhaps using that, maybe earthquake, for example, or drought will have a more effect. So far, the measure that we have used only look at the human cost. There is no measure for economic losses. Okay, so we have to find a way to account for these economic losses. So we are planning to use what is known as a DMAC scale, which kind of is a combination of the human loss and also the economic loss. Of course, the economic loss will be difficult to capture. We have to find a way, probably trying to use one of the filters to try to isolate potential output and trying to find a cyclical component which will capture this loss, and using the DMAC scale to kind of construct our index. And also the measure that we have used so far is ex post. Okay, if you go back to the criteria, I could be a country, I want some help. I will say, okay, yes, I will declare a state of emergency just to get the help. So this will be counted as natural disaster. It could be that we are using natural disaster as an exogenous variable, as in fact is endogenous. So we have to use an alternative disaster measure, okay? The IFO game database on geological and meteorological hazard provide the ex-ante disaster measure, which we can use for this calculation. So there is a little bit of work to do for the few coming months to kind of give a good picture to the paper. Okay. Policymakers tend to, I mean, I was having a conversation with policymakers. I always say academics should refrain from giving a policy lesson because they are not not aware of what is happening in the real life. But I could not resist put forward some policy based on what we found so far. But this could change later as you know, the result could change and so on. So the simple policy lesson. Countries should hold enough reserve to cover at least the short-term debt obligation, which will help protect against vulnerability, protect against contagion-related crisis, okay? Because remember, they use to protect against this crisis, but now they have high-frequency natural disaster, prudent debt management, okay? And tightening short-term debt, okay? For example, having more domestic debt rather than foreign debt, for example. And probably think also of long-term debt. This may be costly. Regional intergovernmental cooperation for post-disaster response. This will help, for example, in the construction and things like that. And probably a long-short policy could be, as everybody is calling country to do now, to put in place mitigating effects to reverse or at least to slow the effect of climate change, because climate change is one of the triggers of this natural disaster. So that was the story we had to tell for this paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think let's give a hand of applause to you, Osman, for this absolutely exciting work and for being able to share with us, you know, quite clearly the motivation of the work, placing the research into contemporary challenges, sharing with us the state of knowledge regarding natural disasters and the implications for foreign reserves, then undertaking huge amount of empirical work and generating some absolutely interesting results. 3 years ago, slightly before lockdown, there was discussion at the ESRC meetings about funding some work on disaster risk finance, which, and I think this would have been a brilliant, background paper covering all main areas, even if people wanted to go into, focusing, say, for example, on one risk, like floods and so forth. But you have actually quite comprehensively covered the issues with many developing countries. And interestingly, I think all the results absolutely interesting. And also you've gone to explore some of the policy implications. And for what I find interesting actually on this policy implication, what's new is saying, okay, central banks or countries need to look at not only the traditional way of holding reserves for international trade purposes, import cover for 3 months, not only mitigating against, say, financial crisis or bank failure or other, issues, but the fact is that each particular country would know about its vulnerability to natural risks, like floods, and storms, and therefore should be able to mitigate and say we're going to have a certain component for this purpose. That's what is the risk management is about. I think that's a very, very a new important finding. And I'll share with you some of the observation, but maybe this work is related to some of the research I've been working on with colleagues, Woolley and Gerhard at Aberdeen, looking at the implications for climate change, the implications of climate change on cost of capital for countries. And so this work does look at the quantitative side, look at quantities, volumes, in terms of, say, amount of foreign reserves or amount of, debt. And I think what's different from that work is that we focus on prices. You see, in the Eurasian type of economics, you can have market clearing through quantities, which is assumed here, or you can have market clearing through prices, which is the other one here. So in the prices, it would have been bond yields, looking at the bond yields, because that's the following these shocks, following these natural results, so a country is able to borrow. Okay, and if they borrow, are they borrowing at a discount or premium? So the yields would have that. But of course, I'm talking about a different, if anything, maybe in your paper, it would be a footnote to say we didn't cover this, but this is a kind of literature. That's where we're going. But so it's not a damning comment on your work. I really love this work. Absolutely. Yeah. There are many areas, I think, of extending this work. And with this audience we have here, I think there will be a new PhD sessions or, great papers. Or why not? We could get together and get a new project running on this service.
Very good,
So let me open up the discussion to but I think before I do that, I should respect those people that have put some comments in the chat room and invite them first to share with us. So yes, Refire, I have already taken up this. The other comment is from Jaideep. Jaideep is a colleague in the School of Finance and Management at SOAS. So Jaideep, please go ahead. Maybe you start with the first one. You have a couple of comments, but
Thanks, Victor, and thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Very interesting. Actually, most of my questions, as you went along, they got answered. So I think every time I asked a question, the answer was on the next slide. So I don't have that much to say, but I just I think what you've said in the further work is really is really going to be helpful in interpreting what you've presented so far, because this whole idea of whether the numerator or the denominator is driving the results is quite important. It also links to the comment that about clearing from prices versus otherwise. So that Victor made earlier, in the sense of which of these two things is driving the changes over a longer period, and especially because we talked about, some countries are probably bad, for example, at doing risk management because they expect some disasters and they don't necessarily plan for those. Then the question of whether the ones that they don't expect, what happens when in those situations. But I think you kind of already looked at that in some way. It's just a question of whether the debt is driving the vulnerability or the reserve flows. And secondly, I think it might be worth thinking a little bit more about whether countries that are vulnerable already. The way you sort of referred to that in your further work was to say those that already hold high reserves, are they more likely to be affected than others? But I mean, there is unfortunately, even though it's an exogenous shock, the existence of the ability to sort of hold reserves beforehand makes the kind of the response a little bit endogenous. That there's a little bit of a problem there, because there's a kind of moral hazard about how much should you insure, and what you should insure, and how. I mean, looking at whether vulnerability induces more vulnerability, or not would be interesting from the point of view of how much moral hazard there is. So the countries that actually don't suffer, although they are originally vulnerable, or suffer less because they receive more aid, let's say, or whatever, that might be something to sort of comment on from a policy perspective as well. Those are all my comments, really.
Yeah, thank you, Jadip. Well noted, and these are very useful comment that we will consider. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jadip, and thanks, Osman, for that acknowledgement. There was also, I think, a point about unexpected and expected disasters. This relates to this the literature, on measuring, gaps or a unspated and an unspated kind of modeling data series. I think for some of the persistent natural disasters, maybe floods, storms, and drought are kind of predictable. In fact, what emerged because at this meeting at the ESRC, we had people not only in finance but people from the physical sciences who study, the physical properties, engineers and others. And what I learned from them is that they argued very strongly that earthquakes cannot be predicted. That among these disasters, earthquakes are not easy to predict, are difficult to predict. So let's assume they are right. And therefore you can predict drought, floods, and storms. So that means the modeling of the data relating to, if we have cities for drought, floods, and so forth, then you'd be, distinguishing between you'd have the series that, predictable component, which would be like fitting a trend, and there would be an unexpected component. Maybe the results would change. Yeah, because you say what you are trying to actually frame your policy on the amount of reserves, the adequacy for reserves is the unanticipated component. Because once you anticipate some of the shocks to happen, then you can quite easily. Although I know for you can quite easily, I know for many developing countries that I work with, that doesn't happen. Even if they know the shocks are happening, they are not in a position to be able to put aside reserves because they are struggling to meet their input cover for 3 months. But suppose that they could be able to do that, then that would be the result might change if you distinguish between anticipated and unanticipated quantities of the reserve for drought, floods, and storms. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Victor. This is a good point. I've not kind of looked at that aspect of the literature, but because expected. I mean, if you know, I mean, we all look at the the meteo every day, so you will know that there's a storm coming in a couple of days. But whether this give you enough time to kind of adjust your decision is another thing. Because when they say they are predictable, I don't know what is the time scale, because this is also important. Okay. It could be that, in 48 hours, we'll have a storm or whatever coming around the UK and things like that. But for the earthquake, it's true that it cannot be predicted. It's just happened suddenly. So I don't know. Yes, I mean, I could look into that, but my initial hunch is it all depends how much time you have between the action happening and you be able to have to take a decision to counteract that. Or you can go like Caribbean countries. We get a storm all the time, so we ensure against this storm. So basically, this is what we have tried to capture here. But it's true, some of the natural disaster can be predicted probably a few hours, few days, or ahead of them happening. But I will dig into this literature to find out more. But thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you indeed. We have two hands up. One by Shula Mulenga, who is from the Bank of Zambia, the Central Bank of Zambia, but also doing a PhD here at SOAS. And then Juan Zuo, my colleague in the School of Financial Management. So Shula first and then Mulenga second. Please go ahead. So Shula first and then Juan second. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Osman, for that very wonderful and insightful presentation.
Thank you, Shula.
My question is around the methodology. I've just been thinking as you were presenting. I'm not sure I heard you correctly. You said you used a panel var?
Yeah, a panel var with, panel var X. Yes, the framework is panel var, but the X is, it accommodates exogenous shock.
Okay.
So if you want, you augment the standard panel var with the X. Yes. X stands for exogenous.
Okay. Because I was thinking when I'm looking at these variables, the variable on the reserve accumulation appears exogenous, and also the variable on debt also appears exogenous. I was sort of thinking that maybe if we took it a step further and considered to run some co-integration and see if we could sort of look at a long-run perspective, maybe if you look at the span of the data that you're using, maybe that could also give some intuition in terms of some relationships and some effects. It's just a thought that was going through my mind as you were presenting. I don't know how feasible or how reasonable it could be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean. But as I said, there are different ways of answering this research question. You can go from standard fixed effect, GMM, panel co-integration, as you suggested. But what we wanted to capture here is, because when you use panel co-integration and so on, you have an estimate, okay, which you interpret. But what we want to look here is, once there is a shock, how long it lasts. For example, if you look at drought, okay, drought was not significant, and then it became significant. In some of the cases, for example, in South Asia, okay, we only had significant for a short period of time, 1 year only. But if you use panel co-integration, you'll miss all this information. So that's why we use the panel var framework. So therefore, we are able to trace the response of our endogenous variable debt, reserve over debt over the time horizon, which is over 12 years. So we are able to follow this. So this is the advantage of using that. But by any means, any technique could be used to answer this research question.
Yes, thank you so much. Because I was looking at when you said the earthquakes in the earlier short run showed that they were not significant in terms of the impact. I was thinking perhaps that if we took the other approach and just check, we may find that maybe it may have some significance in the long run.
Yeah, so there is a possibility. Yeah, there's a possibility that this could be the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
That's okay, no problem. That's fine.
Thank you, indeed, Sheila and Osman. Juan.
Hi, Osman. I think we just met in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago.
Small world, yeah.
Yeah, it's really good to.
Hi.
So to hear what you have been working on, because we did have a little bit of chat about you're doing more about climate change, which is also part of my research.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions, maybe because I didn't really follow the whole bit. The way I understand that you have certain kinds of measurements regarding the vulnerability.
Okay.
So correct me if I'm wrong. Is that, do you think the vulnerability to different types of natural disasters can be measured in a similar way? This is my first question, because in risk and climate change, we actually talking about different index and regarding vulnerability. And my research is more about flooding. So that would be better clarified. The second question is regarding the geographical regions which can be affected. So in your current study, I'm sure there might be something that we can explore further, because even in a large region, they're going to be a different geographical endowments, right? So it's not going to be really surprised in terms of those kinds of areas that are quite vulnerable to some extent, or have been threatening more rapidly, more frequently in certain types of disaster than the other regions. And then it also interests to know how the local infrastructure actually help over the years to improve their mitigation and adaptation to climate change, which means that because your period looking at 1970 to 2080, quite varied time period, which means that certain kinds of region, especially like, Southeast Asia, they have built up the infrastructure because they had lots of confrontation or lots of loss. So there's something whether you have taken into account, or maybe that's your next step to look further. The last one, also in terms of the geographical region, is that even in one particular nation, the natural disaster impact could be quite different across the different areas. So that's from my research, because we're particularly looking into the river delta, which consequently actually had a threat of flooding. And then problem with the flooding cost is that it really depends on how quickly the industry, like what Victor mentioned about input output, actually can be back to the balance. So this might be interesting to look into more zoom in, and because I think that makes more sense for business, especially this is where I come from. But at policy level, definitely I think how the government really recognize differences across the regions in the nation or across the different regions should be quite important. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this interesting question. And in terms of vulnerability, okay, the term vulnerability will mean a different thing to different people. So what we are interested here is just the liquidity position of the country, the external vulnerability. So we look at the literature and see, okay, what measure of external vulnerability in a macroeconomic context is available. So the best measure is the reserve over short-term ratio. You could have used the reserve over import ratio, but as I said, you need data on monthly import, okay, which is not available for many countries. That would have reduced. So our definition of the external vulnerability here is narrow, but it fits our purpose, because kind of this concept is linked to financial crisis and so on. In terms of the geographical distinction, you are right. For different country, it's a different scenario, and I guess probably this will be the next step. It's not part of this paper, but the next step, using a different methodology to kind of capture this heterogeneity. So basically, try to see for each country in our sample, what is the effect, and trying to map this out, because this will give you a different picture. You take Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there's heterogeneity. We didn't find that drought has an effect, but of course, if you take the whole of Africa, it could be that drought has an effect, because it's well known that drought affect this region. But when you work in a panel like this, okay, we have the whole panel, we divide it into region, but you are right, we need to zoom in. And even if you zoom in, you will see, kind of the impact on the different country. And in relation to the third element, in relation to the infrastructure element, we have not really captured that. But you are right. Your level of infrastructure will kind of help mitigate these effects. But probably this will give us some food for thought and something probably we could consider. I know that you say that we cover a long period. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with panel data, it's quite difficult to kind of take a short period and trying to replicate the same exercise. That probably something to look into. But thank you very much for pointing the infrastructure point. Something we'll probably see how to accommodate this.
All right, thank you.
Excellent. I think I can see quite brilliant ideas that would almost mimic a research project, because if this was a research project, it would comprise some work streams or different papers in which, say, this broad canvas work is part of, say, the initial stages. But then it would be possible to pick an area like what one was emphasizing on floods, take a geographical area, one country or a couple of countries along a river band that are affected by those floods, and then do kind of a quasi-experimental type of work in which you are able to say, the difference between, the effect on reserves and how this is how it responds to that big shock of the floods. It would give absolutely useful flavor.
Yeah.
So you'd have different questions drawing from different methodologies, but hanging in there to produce some coherent work. So maybe this discussion between Juan and Osman should continue even well after the end of this session.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. Thank you for the offer. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so we have Charles Corrigan from Leicester. Charles, welcome, and please go ahead and share your question with us.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for a wonderful paper. I don't have a question. I want to know if the paper is available, if there's a working paper available for circulation. And two, I am, ironically enough, organizing a session at the 6th International Conference on Econometrics and Statistics at Waseda University
Yes.
on the topic of rare disasters, etc. And I'd like to extend an invitation to the professor, and I guess I'll find his email and send him an invitation.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Charles. At the moment, the paper is not available. It's halfway through, and we hope before the end of the summer to have the paper ready. But thank you for the invitation to the seminar.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. So we will share, we'll put you in touch, of course, with the Osman and Leicester and Manchester, a short distance apart. So you can even extend this discussion to being, I very well remember when I was visiting Manchester for a year. I very much used to drive to Leicester and the neighboring areas. So it's not, so thanks. But thanks for the conference. Please feel free, Charles, to get in touch with Meng to help you advertise your conference to the network, which would be great. Okay, Sandrine.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Sandrine. And please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, good afternoon. I will just like to ask if, Osman, you consider to do your estimates with some countries, not all the countries, but some countries with quarterly data, because maybe if you have quarterly data for those countries available, maybe the disaster for which you didn't have some impact, maybe you could have some impact for those disasters. So I know that it's very difficult to have a quarterly data, macroeconomic quarterly data, but I know that some developing countries have. So I was wondering if you just look and if you how you see this eventuality. Thank you.
Hi, Sandrine, thank you very much. Sandrine, by the way, is one of my co-authors. We know each other.
That's good. I was going to guess so. Yeah.
Yeah, good to hear from you. Yeah. What you say is true. Yeah. Probably quarterly data will kind of reveal more, more short-term effect. It's true. Probably something we could look into. The natural disaster data is available. I think is you can have it at the month where the natural disaster actually happened. Probably combining that with the macro data. But for the debt, I will debt and reserve. I will be very surprised if we have a monthly or quarterly data. But I will look into it. But what you say is very true. It could be that for the first 2-3 quarters, a disaster will have an effect. Okay, but then when you take the aggregate, it doesn't have an effect. We will kind of look into it. You are absolutely right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandrine, and thank you, Osman, for the response. I think there was interest in this issue from Osman, but I think he's left the meeting. So let me see. I don't seem to have any hands up. So far, there is a hand up by Charles. But I guess this is a legacy hand, right? Or do you have something new? Charles. Okay. So yeah, absolutely interesting. I think I'm just looking for one of the comments. Yes, one of the comments I had jotted down was the interesting aspect that earthquakes don't seem to have any impact at all, and it may well be the case during the summary findings that you made. It may possibly be consistent with the earlier observation I made about the difficulties of capturing or the being able to predict earthquakes, that maybe this could be underlying that. But I guess maybe they are a different class, compared to drought, floods, and storms, and that's why we have no impact on the foreign reserve adequacy. Yeah. I also thought there might be one extra important implication of your study.
Yeah.
Could be in terms of whether we could be able to hedge against these risks, whether we could be able to hedge use the traditional hedging financial instruments to hedge against drought, floods, and storm. This could be just mentioning maybe another possible extension of this work rather than a result from this work. But it could be that if your work has been able to uncover a very important finding, that floods have very important implications and storms for reserve adequacy. And if that's the case, then maybe the question would be, can any of the traditional instruments, where possible, be able to hedge against this risk, since we know that this risk is likely to happen? That, of course, would correlate from a different paper, but this paper would provide a very good foundation for making those extra arguments. We are trying to explore ideas into which this paper could actually ultimately generate a larger and more important research project that can involve many different ideas. For sure, it's a very important area.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
I think there was a hand from Jaideep, but it seems to have gone.
Yeah, sorry, Victor. I thought you were going to talk about that, so I just put it down. I was thinking of the same thing about one of the factors that might affect this particular measure, which is the reserves divided by short-term debt. Is the size of the insurance that's claimed. So in the face of disasters. So some kinds of disasters are insured very significantly, and so we do get data. Like some of the information that you gave at the beginning of the presentation was about economic losses that was linked to presumably based on reinsurance and insurance data. So if those kind of cash flows are also sort of playing a role, then it may be that the vulnerability is resolved through insurance, as Victor was just saying about hedging. So I was just wondering if that, but then I put my hand down because Victor sort of kind of talked about that in the same sense. So.
This is definitely a kind of important issue to consider in the extension of the paper. This is just preliminary steps to probably more research into the topic, but certainly these are quite important to kind of dig deeper to what we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jaideep, you have an important point, and in the context of trying to see that this great work is producing, great ideas and possible extensions. I think, in addition to hedging, well, I mentioned hedging. Hedging is also a kind of a way of ensuring risks. But Jaideep, the area of work is especially, insurance. And even if you take the traditional instruments of insurance rather than hedging, that could be a great extension. Whether to what extent would countries be able to take insurance against this? I don't know whether this is included in what Jaideep has just won a large ESRC project on insurance aspects. But I'm not sure whether you have natural resources in there. But this would be this would be another component of this kind of
definitely.
Okay, great work. I don't seem to see anything new in the chat or even a hand up. So what it remains for me to thank you very much, Osman, and to extend these thanks to your co-authors for sharing with us this extremely important work. It's rich in its own merit and understanding, but also has excited us, ideas around natural resource disasters and what this would mean for, foreign reserves, implications for central bankers, fiscal authorities, and others. So thank you very much indeed. Let's show our applause, hand of applause to you, Osman, for this work. Let me also maybe if you want to say anything finally, just one parting shot if you want to say anything.
First of all, I would like to thank you and your team for giving me this opportunity to present the preliminary result of this paper, and thank all the participants for providing further direction to improve the paper, and also for providing a stimulating discussion for future research. This is what I have to say, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you indeed, and I add my thanks to all of you for being able to join this meeting with Center for Global Finance seminar, and I look forward to welcoming you again next week. For now, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.